Well, great to have you back again, my friend, and I'm excited to do a little retreat thing with you in a couple months. So we'll talk about this later on. We'll put some links in the show notes for everybody. But you and I are going to be down in Texas. You have invited me down to your place to do a little speaking and hanging out and doing some work together, which we had talked about for a while. So it's cool this is finally happening.
Yeah, it's honestly it's amazing. Yeah, we first talked about it maybe a couple of years ago, so it's awesome that that we're able to make it happen, and super excited to have you and a couple other awesome people coming down for hopefully a great event.
Yeah, cool, man. So we're going to get into talking about these GLP-1 uh, drugs, and I'm just curious what your start, what your interest has been. I mean, I'm assuming it's in relation to clients who have had lots of questions for you and who are trying to figure out weight loss solutions or issues with diabetes. Is that kind of where you fit into it?
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of where it kind of dovetails with a couple other things. One is, working in the area of nutrition. And probably when I first started out, I was much more interested in helping people with kind of the more interesting or complicated things. So like, how do you get off blood pressure medications, or how do you not need them, or people coming in with autoimmune type conditions or immune challenges, or working through that. And at the beginning, I probably thought that weight loss was a little bit of like low hanging fruit or kind of simple. So it wasn't something that interested me too much, because even when I work with patients on weight loss now, we're working on helping the body function better, and the weight loss is almost a side effect of it. But as I was in practice longer and worked with more patients, I realized like, hey, this is a real thing, and this is a really important part of the process. And then different pieces have come to me over that time, and we can kind of talk about as we go. But it's what I've kind of look at it now is a system where there's 7 different steps that we need to work through that could cause someone to have difficulty losing weight or to be gaining weight. Everything from blood sugar, adrenal, thyroid, to looking at stress, to looking at diet, exercise, sleep. So we can work through different systems to find out what's going on. So all of that's going on in the background over 15 years of practice. And then the GLP-1 phenomenon happens, and then seeing patients on it, getting questions about it, hearing concerns about, what about possible thyroid cancer, and what about this? And then my friend's on it and they lost 25 pounds in 6 months. And, it seems like an easy thing to do. And so it really came from a lot of conversations with patients, a little bit with practitioners as well, and just the zeitgeist around it, and really wanting to understand it really well for myself. And then ultimately got invited to present to some practitioners to share that knowledge with them, so we can be as informed as possible as nutritionists and doctors to help our patients navigate the conversation and the alternatives if they decide not to do it, as well as if they decide to do it, what are the possible risk factors and how can you mitigate those to the best extent possible.
Yeah, and 27 years in health for me, I've seen a lot of fads, especially as it relates to especially as it relates to weight loss, but there's been lots of them. But my thing with any kind of drug intervention or any kind of pharmaceutical intervention is, there's always going to be some risk of any input that you put into a system. So I'm always looking at it from that standpoint, and also, there's always a money making part of this. So. I guess maybe a good place to start is what is a GLP agonist? So anybody who's sort of interested in what these different drugs, Ozempic, Wegovy, and some of these drugs, what do they do in the body?
Good. So GLP-1 receptor agonist is the technical term, but what most people know them as, like you said, it's Ozempic and Wegovy, which are both a molecule called semaglutide. Ozempic is the weight loss version. Wegovy is working on diabetes. And then there's tirzepatide, and that's working on, that's the molecule, and it's Mounjaro for diabetes, Zepbound for weight loss. Okay. So, and just big picture, it's the exact same molecule. or the exact same drug, whether you're using it for weight loss or whether you're using it for blood sugar. The difference is the dosage. So the dosage for weight loss is up to 5 times higher, between 1.7 and 2.4 milligrams, typically a weekly injection, compared to 0.5 and 1. So that's what they are. So then the question is, what do they do in the body? And there's basically 4 main mechanisms of action. So if you talk to someone on it and you talk to patients or friends on it, right? The most striking thing about it is, I'm just not that hungry, right? Yeah. And it's they eat less. So it's a general mechanism of caloric restriction. So how does that work in terms of the weight loss? And basically, it slows down digestion process. So it reduces gastric emptying. So that's the main mechanism of action you have there. So it just slows down the entire digestion
which makes
tract.
You feel full.
Exactly, and we'll get into some of the side effects, but GI side effects happen 50 to 80% of the time. Yeah. This is where you get gastroparesis, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, constipation, all of those show in there. So that's one. And then the other mechanism of action, there's one that reduces appetite. So that's very much connects to that. So it slows down the digestive tract, it reduces appetite. And then there's 2 that relate to blood sugar. One is it stimulates insulin production. So it causes you to make more insulin, which will in turn lower blood sugar, all else being equal. Okay. And then it inhibits a different pancreatic hormone called glucagon, which tends to raise blood sugar. So you make less of the hormone that raises blood sugar, you make more of insulin, the hormone that lowers blood sugar.
And those are, insulin and glucagon are the 2 that are always trying to balance each other, right, in terms of blood sugars.
Exactly, yeah, those are the main pancreatic hormones that support blood sugar. Cortisol, the stress hormone, will also raise blood sugar. That comes from, typically not from the pancreas or the adrenal, but the main pancreatic hormones, glucagon simply raises it, insulin lowers it. And and it works on both of those to affect blood sugar.
Okay. And I correct me if I'm wrong, because I had a little bit of a course in nutrition at one point, thinking I might go that direction. But glucagon is a hormone that's released from proteins. Insulin from, maybe it's more complex than that, and insulin from carbohydrate.
So I think generally you're on the right track. Yeah, definitely insulin is released in response to basically elevated blood sugar. Would trigger that. So when the blood sugar is high, so typically you think a carbohydrate meal would do that. Right. Glucagon will be released when blood sugar is dropping a little low, and I believe there is a protein connection that glucagon will be stimulated by protein consumption as well.
Okay. I was just curious. That was just something that was sort of floating around from my memory.
Yeah.
So let's get into. I think we can go right into. That's kind of the basics. I think I'm curious about if there are any best uses, but I feel like first it's important to get into what the potential side effects are, because as I got to watch some of what you presented about this topic, and it's pretty clear that people are having trouble staying on some of these drugs, that the fall off rate within a very short period of time is pretty high, and long-term effects, people, it's something down to one of the things you presented, it went down to like 2% after 4 years, which is problematic. And I think that'll all come to the surface here as we go through what the potential side effects are. So as you mentioned, having gastroparesis, or slowing of things through the gut is certainly a factor. You also mentioned the risk for pancreatitis. Is that another part of this too?
Yeah, so good. So let's kind of go through that. So GLP, just to take a half step back, GLP-1 is a naturally occurring hormone that's made by what's called the L cells in the intestine. So you naturally make GLP-1,
okay, gotcha,
which is what's found in the injection. Yeah. The difference is the GLP-1 that's injected in these drugs has a half-life of about a week, which is why you inject it once a week. Okay. The GLP-1 that's found in the gut has a half-life of about 1.5 minutes, so to 5 minutes. So it's a difference. It's orders of magnitude different. So these are natural effects. Like the body will naturally stimulate, stimulate blood sugar, show down digestion, have us not be less hungry. But when what's happening in the context of normal metabolism and eating, it's happening for minutes, or even, we can measure that, 120 seconds, right, compared to 7 days. Yeah. So what happens when you change that, right? What happens when you introduce a peptide in the body that's normally supposed to be there under control of the digestive system and of the body for 1.5 to 5 minutes, and instead it's there for a week on and off? And the answer is a lot. So you brought up a couple things. So the pancreatitis. So there was a study that basically looked at 16 million medical records. And so it's one of the largest studies I think I've come across in this area. And they looked at 16 million medical records, and what they found is just over a 9 times greater risk of pancreatitis. Yeah. So absolutely, that's something we're seeing. It's the risk of bowel obstruction went up 4 times, so like 400% higher. And then gastroparesis, which is, a medical term, basically the Greek means stomach paralysis. But think of, for the people listening, think of feeling full, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and bloating and heartburn. So the risk of gastroparesis goes up 3.67%, so 3.67 times, so 350% or so. And the other thing they showed up is basically a 50% increase in biliary disease. Think gallstone, congested gallbladder. So that was some of the main things that came out of that study. That wasn't all of them, but that was some of those that you mentioned right there. So definitely we see all 3 of those.
What are the symptoms of pancreatitis?
Yeah, great question. So this is something that can be a significant problem for someone. It's basically inflammation of the pancreas. One of the things you'll look at is you can see elevated pancreatic enzymes. That's what they'll kind of look for on that. But fever, bloating, diarrhea, abdominal pain, those are some of the symptoms that you'll feel as a patient as you're experiencing that. But it can be something that's, potentially a very serious situation. Yeah.
And then, if someone, I'm just curious now, like if someone is on the drug, are there other considerations? I guess I'm just thinking people are going to take this. These are the potential side effects. Is there anything that they can do to counteract effects of taking something like this?
Yeah. Yes, there are. And I'll add a couple other side effects that are important and talk about what we could do about it. So one of the things is, as someone loses weight, up to 39 to 40%, where 2 of the largest trials of the weight loss is actually muscle loss. Yeah. So we're seeing people lose weight, which is, 1, it's a problem to lose muscle for anyone. Yeah. And 2 is it's an issue because as someone comes off the drugs, which 30% do within the first 3 months, and as you mentioned with that one study, over time, a tremendous amount of people come off either because of the side effects or cost or both. Yeah. And most likely, just according to the research, you're regaining, a significant percentage of the weight within a short period of time. So let's say someone loses from 200 pounds down to 170, but they lose 40% muscle. Well, if they go back from 170 back to 192, well, unless they're regaining 40% muscle at that time, which is probably unlikely, you can actually be 5 or 10 pounds lighter than when you started, but less metabolically healthy because of the lost muscle mass. So
that lost weight comes back mostly as fat, or
so that's the thing. Unless we're being intentional with our protein, unless we're being intentional with some strength training exercise specifically to trigger muscle growth. Yeah. So that kind of gets into that question. So the path of least resistance is you're not going to build that much muscle unless you're really intentional about protein. So that gets into some of the solution you were talking about. So if someone is on this, I think you need to be real intentional about protein consumption, right? And really nutrient consumption in general, because let's say someone's, basically the drugs work by caloric restriction. They slow down your digestive tract, and they limit the amount of food you eat. So instead of having, let's just use a round number of 2,000 calories a day to get all your vitamins, minerals, healthy fats, and protein, you now have 1,200 calories or whatever the number is.
Yeah.
So you've got to be that much more nutrient dense with all of the foods you're having. And I think specifically protein, healthy fats, vitamins, minerals, you got to be real intentional about what that is. But specifically for the muscle loss, it's protein. And, kind of I was looking at the side of a box the other day, and it was something like the recommended protein is something like 50 grams of protein for the average person.
Mm-hmm.
I think a much more rational number is something like 0.7 grams of protein per pound of body weight. So if someone's, 0.55 to 0.7, so if someone's 200 pounds, it's 110 on the low end, up to 140. And then if you're doing significant weight training, it can be, higher than that. I mean, there's a range because it depends on protein quality and type and digestion. But the point is the traditional recommendations are way low as a general rule. Yeah. But we got to be real intentional about protein and real intentional about a stimulus to build muscle, which is basically strength training.
Yeah, especially at advanced ages. I mean, And I'm guessing some of this stuff is being used for younger people, and they might have more success, say, under 40. But in advanced ages, it's already hard to keep. We lose half or 1% or something, annually if we're not really pushing ourselves physically, which is just sort of natural based on people's tendencies as they get older to get deeper in their careers and not have as much time because of kids and activities and whatnot. So that's one of those things that I'm sure, and I feel like more and more evidence keeps coming out about the importance of building muscle mass for metabolic process and all sorts of other things that basically keep us well. It almost kind of seems like you can equate muscle mass or muscle density to health and wellness at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's people who absolutely make that connection. I think that's right. And it's in muscle. The other thing is very metabolic tissue, so it takes energy to maintain muscle, which means by having protein and eating that, we're actually helping to raise that metabolism or set point of our metabolism for how much we can burn. So that's absolutely true.
Yeah, and metabolism also affects all sorts of other system processes. It's not just a muscle thing, which I think people don't really get.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think that's absolutely true. And the other areas I was going to lead into that, which connects to the protein conversation, is one of the other side effects they've seen is that really struck me was a 45% increased risk of suicidal ideation.
I know. That's sort of the interesting part is again talking about these different processes that is then going to affect the whole mental health component of our experience too. When as you were saying earlier, that with that long term effect, and what we don't really know yet about how this is going to go once we stop taking the drug. We know that mental health piece can be affected fairly quickly with this. I mean, it seems like it can happen within a very short period of time, and if they're on SSRIs, right, that's an even greater risk.
Yeah, it goes up to you're exactly right. It goes up to a 350% increase if we're taking antidepressants.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's certainly, it's something that needs to be aware of, and I mentioned, I think in that other talk you saw, but the EU is actually looking into launched an investigation into that increased risk of suicidal ideation with the drug, because we're talking about that is not an insignificant number. And SSRIs stand for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, so these are some of the most common antidepressants that are on the market, and these are medications just to give such names as Celexa, Lexapro, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft. Those are common brand names someone might know from that. But it's a very common class of medication. So this isn't, this is something that's going to affect a lot of people, and it's certainly something to be aware of. And it connects to the protein conversation because a lot of those neurotransmitters, including serotonin, are made from protein, made from amino acids. And, oh, by the way, 95% of all the serotonin, that feel-good hormone, that the SSRI, which selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, that those drugs are supposedly working on, is made in the gut.
Yep.
So
That blew me away when you were talking about that. That's like, oh, it gets right down to that almost every time, that we forget what the gut, does in terms of production for all sorts of, hormonal responses.
And that idea of a gut feeling, right? That it alludes to this idea of there's this, we have an incredible part of our nervous system that's in the gut. Medically, they call it the enteric nervous system, which is basically the nervous system in the digestive tract. But this idea that, like I said, 95% of that hormone is actually made in the gut. So what we think is our antidepressant hormone, our feel-good hormone that affects our brain, well, like you said, 95% of that's coming from the gut. So as we're taking something that's changing gut physiology incredibly, it almost stands to reason that it's also affecting that hormone and mental health as well.
And that whole idea of like gut instinct, that was the thing when you were talking about this in the talk. I was thinking about how I'm sure the gut picks up all sorts of information, and if you shut down certain processes that go to the gut, you probably the gut loses that information store. Almost kind of like, have you ever heard about, when people are on birth control medication and they pick a partner, right? Women, I'm talking about the pill.
Oh, yeah.
And that it can change their pheromonal senses, and so they end up picking partners sometimes who are, they like the smell of when they meet them. They come off the pill and they suddenly smell differently to them.
Yeah.
And how tragic that could potentially be. But I was thinking about it in relation to gut, that I bet the gut has, it's a very similar kind of thing where we're picking up all sorts of information. We put it on this medication for a while, or it seems like it's going to be hard for people to come off of a lot of times. But if they do come off of it, there must be a lot of confusion that goes on then, physiologically.
Yeah, and there's sometimes where the symptoms, the side effects go away immediately coming off the drugs, and there's definitely cases where those side effects have persisted longer term and kind of don't immediately snap back, right? Because we're also creating, it's a form of starvation in the body, and caloric restriction generally can be a useful tool, right? But you really got to be careful about what you're doing, because it's really easy to throw off the thyroid, or not get the essential fats the brain needs, or not have the zinc or the magnesium, or the B vitamins or the minerals that support brain health. It's very easy to do, and when the body's in starvation, it changes its physiology, right? It affects thyroid hormone. It affects the adrenals. It's a state of stress, and that has an effect. And it's an experiment now that people are living in for an extended period of time. And will it help you lose weight? In general, yes. The question is, are you losing fat or are you losing muscle? And then what are the side effects that happen? And then ultimately the choice each individual gets to make is that worth it? And does that align with their health goals?
Right. And that's kind of part of it for me, is like, I've heard some kind of amazing things about its use. Obviously, if you have diabetes, there's a lot of things that you're having to sort of work with to keep in balance, because it's potentially a very dangerous condition. But I've been hearing stuff about how it seems to help compulsive behaviors in general. People with online shopping addiction, any sorts of drug issues, alcohol addiction, that there could be. I never think of something as necessarily being completely bad, but as with most pharmaceuticals, I believe the intervention has to be a bridge to something, and so. This is where I always end up pushing back when someone's like so excited about this. I want them to meet the goals that they have. I don't want to take something away from them, but also once they're having some success, okay, then what's the way out? And I would say the same with just about any medication.
Yeah, exactly. Because is the long-term solution? Because we know when people stop, in general, if you stop taking the medication, there's some weight gain that comes back. Yeah. Right. That's kind of the pattern. So the question is this something you plan to be on for the rest of your life? And if not, then the question of what is that bridge is important. And, I'm a chiropractor and work in the nutrition area. So what I do is not, prescribing medications is not kind of what I do, and outside of that, and I'm working almost exclusively with patients on holistic alternatives to this, or managing the side effects of it through diet, nutrition, things like that. That being said, I'm open to the idea of it being a good idea in a select number of patients if it's used short term to break food cravings, break habit patterns, jumpstart the process of losing weight, eating healthier, and exercise. Yeah. And then there's a short-term transition. It's a very clear goal in how it's done. I'm open to that. I think mostly that's a theoretical option because I think it's rarely done that way. But I'm open to the idea of that being a helpful thing for certain patients when done correctly. And like you said, it's how well. I mean, you talked about the bridge, and then expand on that. Like, how well is that bridge defined, and what is the start point? What's the end point? And then what can we do while we're on it to get the most nutrient dense, which is basically focusing on protein, focusing on fiber, focusing on healthy fats that'll feed the brain, focusing on gallbladder and liver support, because that will help lubricate the bowel and help support that function. Right. So there's certain things we can look at.
That's what I was just going to ask you about. So a lot of people will jump to this before peering into other things, which could be system problems. So maybe this will take us a little bit into this realm of what alternatives might be, because if someone comes to you and they're really struggling, they've increased their exercise, they've improved their diet, and they're still not losing weight, what kinds of things would you look into, or what kind of support would you look into from a more holistic perspective?
Yeah, and I think it's just my experience with this is, for some people it's easier to lose weight, and for some people it's definitely harder to lose weight. Right. So there's definitely an incredible individuality to this. Yeah. That being said, the systems, I think, through the first thing we look at is supporting liver detoxification, supporting gallbladder health. And what that means is, a lot of times fat cells will be storage places where the body will put toxins. Right. So if your body has something that's toxic, it doesn't want it in the blood, it doesn't want it in the organ, so it'll throw it in a fat cell. And how would I explain to patients, it's kind of like when your in-laws are coming over and you're trying to organize the house really quickly, and you just like throw stuff in a closet, or like in that one door, and you just hope no one opens that cabinet. Like, please, whatever you do, why grandma's over, don't open that cabinet. Like, that's kind of what the body will do with toxins in the fat cells. So what does that mean? Well, as we start to lose fat, or our goal is to burn fat, then what we'll need to do is release those toxins back into the blood, and we need a competent liver, by extension kidney, and gallbladder to be able to process that. So detoxification or purification program could be very helpful. Gallbladder health can be there. Excess estrogens can lead to weight gain. So things like cruciferous vegetables could be very important in supporting that, as well as certain supplements. So that's one. Kind of connected to that is sleep. We know that having a dysregulated circadian rhythm can absolutely lead to weight gain as well. So that's kind of level one of kind of where I work. And do you want me to keep going, or you want to ask?
Sure. No, I'm curious to hear more too. Yeah.
So then from there, and my general rule is I like to take it step by step with patients, and just kind of, what I explain to them is the goal is to lose maybe a pound or two a week if they have weight to lose. And as long as they're doing that, we just stay at that level. And if need to, we kind of go to the next level. It doesn't all have to be done sequentially, but anyway, I organized it sequentially, and that's how I think. And it could
there could be some testing, I'm guessing, that goes on within this, right? Because because I've heard recently that some people are having problems, say with intermittent fasting. There's some side effects that can happen for someone who may have toxicity issues in their body that they're not aware of. Right. So that kind of gives you this testing ground before you really start pushing harder into it to really work on that detox part, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Because you'll want to ease into it to the extent the patient's able to start. And, for example, just to do a short aside on that, like if you're going to work with someone to support liver and gallbladder purification, detoxification, the first thing you got to make sure is, are they having regular bowel movements? Because if not, you're going to detox to retox, is one of the mentors I said, right? If it's not leaving the body, it's just going to sit, in the gut and colon, and then be reabsorbed. So there's a couple things you can look at around that, but that's one thing you look at is, hey, are we eliminating? And if not, we need to start with that before we can pull things from tissues and pull things from organs. We got to start with regular elimination there. From there, adding
so then next level, I'm curious what you do after that then.
Protein. So the second thing I look at is protein. So it kind of optimized protein levels in the body, add some additional protein, and basically going closer to that 0.7 grams per pound of body weight. So again, if somebody's about 200 pounds, aiming for around 140, give or take. And then, connected to that, we might look at protein digestion and protein utilization to say, are we doing that? From there, we might eliminate, actually at that same time, we're eliminating processed carbohydrates, sugar, soda, white potatoes, wheat. We'll keep some complex carbs in at that point, things like sweet potato, wild rice, which is a higher protein, lower carbohydrate, grain, quinoa, things like that. And we'll do, so we'll work on diet as well, focus on protein, healthy fats, vegetables, and just some healthy, healthy complex carbohydrates. So from there, we'll then eliminate fruit, and then eliminate even some of those complex carbs, even the quinoa, wild rice, things like that. Focus more on protein and fiber. Interestingly enough, those are two of the foods that naturally trigger the GLP-1 production by the body. So protein is one of the biggest ones. The other things that will naturally trigger GLP-1 production are bitter foods. So things like arugula and even digestive bitters. So that's herbs like berberine, gentian, even there's something called wormwood, which is an antiparasitic herb, but anything that's really bitter will generally stimulate GLP-1 production. So
do you know if fermented foods are part of that by any chance?
You know what, I believe
I'm just curious because I got a book not too long ago. I was just curious to learn more about fermented foods, and I wondered if you might know. What I remember reading about was fermented foods. There was some feedback between the fermented foods and the cells that made GLP-1, and there was a connection between the health of the microbiome and GLP-1 production. Right, and that's kind of what I heard it more in relation to the microbiome, but I was just wondering if it had any impact on GLP-1 production.
Yeah, so looking at it, that absolutely can happen. It can stimulate GLP-1 production. It can also support the L cells in cleaning up that GLP-1, or making more of that GLP-1 as well. Yeah, I can. Give me just 1 second.
Sure.
Let me pull up. So it's basically, just pulling up some. So to go a little deeper on that, protein, certain amino acids, specifically phenylalanine, glutamine, arginine, tryptophan, fiber, and certainly vegetables. And then it was the piece I was looking for was short chain fatty acids produced by the gut microbiome. Can trigger GLP-1 production, as well as it seems like fermented foods can have an effect directly as well as indirectly through that process.
Yeah. Because I've seen all sorts of things about the sort of history of fermented foods and the cultures who don't have problems with weight gain. So I figured there must be something in there.
Yeah, and there's certain it's not an area I've dived into deeply, but there's certain strains of probiotics that they'll look at having a weight loss type effect, or changes in gut microbiome that you'll see in patients who gain weight. So you can look at that, and they've even done some fecal transplants of from like basically skinnier mice to more overweight mice.
Right. I've seen
putting those bacteria in and changing the metabolism of the mice. That's
crazy. So these phases that you go through. So, it seems like you're just sort of you're paring down to foods that also become they go through less process, right? I mean, anytime we add not a complex carbohydrate, it has to go through this whole like insulin response storage system, pull it back out again, kind of, right? So that all this extra energy. So in some ways, it seems like what you're doing is you're also weaning down how much energy the body has to sort of put into digestion, and it seems almost a little bit too.
Yeah, interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think there is some truth to that in terms of the metabolism and storage of it.
Right.
Yeah, because ultimately a lot of those complex carbs and the fruit, like what the body does with that extra sugar and what insulin does is basically turn sugar into fat, right? Yeah. It also helps us build protein, so insulin has a couple different effects in the body. But you're right. It's kind of eliminating that from the complex carbohydrate story of things that would be turned into fat.
And organs that will have to, would have to work harder and all that kind of stuff. I mean, based on my work, which about, I mean, I'm always thinking about the autonomic nervous system in relation to how much energy output needs to go on when we're sort of in fight or flight all the time. I say it's the big spender, it's in terms of energy, right? So in a way I'm just trying to break this down into some very simple thing as it relates to nutrition, but it feels to me like we if we do that nutritionally, metabolically, bring down stress, increase our sleep, we're almost naturally going to start being able to sort of, process food better, that, detox things, happen a little bit better in that setup as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the only exception to that might be the protein, because I think that is kind of energy intensive to digest. Yeah. But if we go back to your autonomic nervous system example, it actually fits perfectly, because what you're talking about is just balancing the autonomic nervous system, getting it back to rest, and then what's it going to do? Well, it's naturally going to be able to produce an acidic stomach and the enzymes we need to be able to digest. So there is definitely an element of we're doing this, getting back to nature and just kind of removing the interference to allow that to happen.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, the interference. I feel like that's, I mean, I couldn't help but go through this, and I listened to, for anybody interested, I'll link this on there too, but Trevor Noah did a bit on Ozempic, but from a more cultural perspective. So he brought in a woman who wrote for, did you hear it by any chance?
No.
I'll send it. So, it's also interesting because it was a woman who wrote for the New Yorker and another woman who was from the UK, Black woman from the UK. And so they talked about it a lot from this cultural perspective of it being kind of a white drug that it was, and or there was a socioeconomic part of this. It's not just white. I have a Black friend who's on it right now as well. So it's but there's a part of that is, we'll get into the cost of this, and we could talk about it from different perspectives, but certainly, the amount of money being made off of this particular drug, and the fact that I feel like the U.S. has been a target for this drug, and part of it is because of the issues that we have with obesity in our culture. But I almost feel like there's something even more than that beyond the, where does that weight gain come from? What is the compulsivity that's sort of part of our culture that sort of makes us, that was kind of a big part of the conversation, that, it's not that this doesn't happen in other places in the world, that the rest of the world is catching up to us in some ways. But yeah, curious about your thoughts on that. And I know you've done some analysis of sort of cost and impact on our healthcare system too.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple different ways, or many ways to answer that question or build off it. But I think this is kind of the idea of the story of I went to Europe or Italy and I could eat pasta and I didn't gain weight, and I come back to the U.S. and I do, right, and connected to the amount of gluten that's different between one versus the other, the fact that genetically modified foods are illegal, and
the amount of the amount of Roundup being used in our crops.
Exactly. It's a glyphosate. Yeah, exactly. So I think there's a whole bunch of different stories around that. To you have, I mean, even looking at COVID, the U.S. had one of the worst death rates in the entire world, despite having one of the most technologically advanced, if not the most technologically advanced medical system. So either we're doing a bunch of things wrong, or we had some really sick people to begin with, or a combination of both, right? And we knew even from the beginning, like the average person who passed away from COVID had, I think it's 3.4 comorbidities. So there was an incredible amount of that. So I think that partially explains some of what we had in the United States with the number of comorbidities, or the the kind of that differentiation between lifespan and health span.
Yeah.
So I think that definitely contributes to that process. And then you want to talk about cost, kind of, and how that fits into it.
Yeah.
So on average, it's roughly about $1,000 a month to take the medication, which is obviously, incredibly costly. There's a Medicare ruling. It actually goes back to 2003, called the Medicare Modernization Act, that specifically prohibited Medicare from paying for drugs prescribed for weight loss. So you talk about a history of seeing weight loss drugs in your, I think, 27 years. It's kind of like going back to fen-phen and going back to some other ones where you see these drugs that come on and they're like, seem like miracle drugs, and then all of a sudden, X number of years later, it's basically collapsed in shambles and they're off the market. And it's interesting. We've seen that a little bit with Ozempic and Novo Nordisk. Just looking at, the stock price, or the total market cap of Novo Nordisk, it peaked in July of last year, so July of 2024, at about $640 billion. Which is almost, obviously it's like, it's incredible, especially because it's based in Denmark, and the GDP of Denmark was about 400 billion. So it means this company had a higher market cap than the entire GDP of the country it's based out of, which is just incredible. And at the end of the year, it had already dropped under 400 billion.
Wow.
So we'd already seen it was 381 billion at the end of 2024. So it already dropped. It's like a 35-40% decrease in the Novo Nordisk stock price and market cap, in about 6 months. It's now, I'm just pulling it up today, it's March 13th, it's at 258 billion. So we've seen it dropped close to 60%, no, over 60%, just about 60% in about 9 months from where that's happening. So I use that as just kind of a window into the narrative's cracking, right? And this narrative
makes you ask why.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly a reason for it, right? It's showing up in sales or potential liability or side effects or what they thought was possible in July last year. 60% of that, at least using this as a measure, have disappeared from that. So I think that's a good barometer. At that point, the second most valuable company in Europe was LVMH, which is Louis Vuitton, Moet, and Hennessy. So that was the second most valuable company, and they were at 325 billion. So at its peak, it was worth twice as much as any other company in Europe.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So I mean, it was a phenomena, health-wise, obviously, and culture-wise, but also financially as well. And like I said, 60% of that's dropped out. So we're beginning to see some cracks in that narrative manifest and show up.
So do you think that has something to do with, have there been any changes in healthcare coverage? I mean, were people getting it covered to deal with, secondary, comorbidity issues? Like, is that part of why they were letting this weight loss drug get used?
So that's a really good question. So one is, it did drop about 12% when I think it was something like 12% on when Trump got elected, and Robert Kennedy was coming in with the idea that they were going to be less likely to approve it, because a lot of predictions for growth were based on the U.S. market. Like in most of Europe, you actually can't use the drug for weight loss. They can use it for diabetes, but not for weight loss. But to your question, were they trying to get around it? And the answer is yes. And what they were doing is they started to approve Wegovy or Ozempic for things like cardiovascular health. So they were looking at and diabetes. So you're looking at what other comorbidities would somebody who's overweight have, and then could we get the drug approved for those comorbidities, like you were asking? So by extension, Medicare could cover that. And they were working on that through the end of the Biden administration. I saw some of those headlines come across in the fourth quarter of 2024. I haven't seen any so far this year. That there may have happened, but up to the fourth quarter, that's exactly the strategy I saw them going, is getting approved for those comorbidities to kind of backdoor their way in.
Yeah. So it will, I mean, I'm just looking at what the future might look like is that it will be a unauthorized medical care thing, and people have to pay out of pocket for it, most likely.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're looking at now, because, as, Robert Kennedy, what he said, or my thought is if we're spending $1,000 a month as a country, as an example, you can buy, gym membership, you could buy lab testing, you can buy organic food, you could
imagine what they could do with you and me for that much.
Exactly. You can buy a whole bunch of stuff that would actually do a lot more to create health and not have that effect. So I think there is a value proposition that has to be looked at. Now, part of the idea with the drug is easy and simple, and you don't have to do anything. Yeah. So that's there. But if we look at the cost benefit of, if we're spending, as a country, if you're spending $1,000 to try to make someone healthier, what's the best and most efficient way to spend that money? And I think that opens up a lot of possibilities, including, hey, what else can we do with that? Yeah.
I mean, it goes back to this suspicious nature people have of where government money is being spent, and or even insurance dollars are being spent. Because early in my career, I thought, this was back in the 90s, I thought that things were going in the direction of, they were starting to, chiropractic was starting to be covered, pretty easily, just about any situation. Acupuncture was starting to get covered. Massage was starting to get covered. And then they slowly started pulling out things, or just getting much more critical about what the use of those were. When, we look at this, like, let's say every American had $1,000 a month to spend on their own health, like HSA, health insurance type model, savings type model. And if we had that kind of money just guaranteed to us, as opposed to like, only if you have something really wrong with you. Only if you have, multiple comorbidities can you get this. We would be so much healthier. And if you look at that from a cost perspective, it actually saves so much. And I just can't figure out why we don't go that direction.
Yeah. I think, it's something like 80% of all healthcare dollars are spent in the last 6 months of life. And it's something like, an open heart surgery costs, I don't know, $50,000 to $100,000, just pick a number. And, a bottle of tuna oil every 3 weeks, that would cut your risk of sudden cardiac death and heart attack by 90%. Right. I mean, I saw the number looked at with those external defibrillators they started putting everywhere in schools and things like that. And they cost a few $1,000s each, where you look at what you're hoping to accomplish with that versus if we just had, like I said, some more omega-3s, or we took the trans fats out of our diet. I mean, there's definitely some incredibly cost-effective ways we could address the healthcare crisis if our goal was to truly address the crisis. And so you ask the question, is it intentional or is it incompetence? And there's probably a lot of intentionality.
It's a complicated thing. I mean, I'm less of a. I mean, I think there are sort of conspiracy things that happen. I think there's sometimes like a one smart person who's really pushing hard on something, and the other people aren't even aware of it, and that stuff gets moved through. But I think more often than not, it's just not, things aren't done very strategic, because whatever the situation, hospitals are very complicated. Insurance companies get sort of bogged down in things. Politically, we get bogged down in stuff, and we're just not focusing on the right things. But, I feel like having these kinds of conversations helps people get organized, at least for themselves, about how they might want to, think about, spending their own time and dollars, because that's what I try to guide people, to in my practice. I don't want them stuck doing therapy all the time. I want them doing the things that are going to actually keep them well. But also I think there has to be some strategy involved.
And that's the question I want to look at with this conversation. It's like, So recognizing that someone has some frustration or desire to lose some weight, it can be the beginning of a conversation to say, okay, what's the body telling us? What can we learn from this to understand the systems better, right? If we just build on briefly some of those other steps, we could look for, food allergies or intolerances. We talked about that in a previous conversation, kind of around the carnivore diet or elimination diets in general.
Yeah.
But we can also look at thyroid support. We can look at insulin sensitivity, pancreatic function, blood sugar. And then we can also look at stress. One of the stories there's a study that we might have talked about it before, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which basically looked at those stressful situations. And, one of the things they found is the more stressful situations someone experiences as a child, the more likely they were to be obese as an adult, right? And Felitti, who led that study, was investigating why people dropped out of a weight loss program, how it started.
Interesting.
And what he found is
I didn't know
he interviewed him. Yeah, so he was working for Kaiser Permanente out in California.
Yep.
And he was overseeing a weight loss clinic in San Diego, which was responsible for, or basically dealt with people who are as little as 30 pounds overweight, but really looking 50, 100 to 600 pounds of weight loss. And about 50% of the people dropped out, so he started interviewing them. And what he found is all of them were actually losing weight. And so he asked the question, he said, so why are you dropping out of a weight loss program if you're losing weight? And, to a person, what they told him is, you don't understand. It's not that we don't know what to eat. It's not that we don't know what to do. It's that they were using food to handle an area of pain.
Yes.
Right? Was basically what it was. It was a solution to a problem. Like somebody else might use alcohol, like somebody else might use a drug. They were using food. So he got curious about that, did a bigger study with 17,000 people and expanded those findings. So I had read about that, was looking at it when a patient walked into my office, and she was a little over 300 pounds, wanted to lose 70 to 100 pounds. So so I started talking to her, and one of the things I remember Felitti said in that original research, he said in those conversations, what I found is if someone was 50 pounds overweight, they didn't gain a pound a month for 4 years, right? He said they would often jump in weight and then just stay steady and jump and stay steady. Mm-hmm. So I asked this patient about it. So, and that's what their pattern was, jump and stay jump and level off and then jump and level off. So I asked, what was going on just prior to that? And they basically described physical abuse, emotional trauma, and a series of other things. And there was a couple discrete episodes. So we worked through a shock on those two things. And that patient lost about 17 pounds in 2 weeks. And some of it was, obviously physical weight loss, but it was the emotional release from that. And then it was building from that. So because of that, looking at shocks or stressful situations as impetus for weight loss and seeing the body hold on to that. Now you can look at that from like kind of an emotional, a counseling, a conversational sort of way to help them work through that, either in the office or with someone, or we can work through that through, support for the organs that are stressed by it. Obviously, that well with your work of the autonomic nervous system, like that HPA, hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal axis. So we can work through that. But that's where that original study came from, and that's what he started, was actually working in a weight loss clinic.
That's really interesting. I mean, some of this stuff came up in the Trevor Noah dialogue as well, which is that the thing about weight culturally is that it's something that's so much more visible, to your community, and so there's almost kind of this new thing going on with these drugs where it's like there's almost like a new shaming, like why would you stay heavy when you could just take this drug now? But to your point of like, some of what's going on with a person is often also going on below the surface. And we don't see it as much when their addiction is, porn or compulsive shopping or something else, right? It's like that's not a visible thing. But and these are all potentially, emotion-based challenges that are going on with the person. But when it's food, we sometimes are just focusing on the food and not the underlying factors as well. But besides the system function things, really looking at the mental emotional part.
Yeah, exactly. And I just think, like, if we just look at, one of the main parts of quantum physics is this idea of like a wave particle duality. So basically something's a particle, but it's also a wave at the same time. So it's like, if we look at people, we can look at them as a physical body, and we can look at them as an emotional or spiritual being. And the question is, how much of the time are we seeing them just the physical, but are we also looking at that mental, spiritual, emotional side?
Yeah.
And what quantum physics tells us is a particle is a wave and a wave is a particle. So what shows up in mass is energy, and what shows up as energy is mass as well. So the two are equal. They're constantly going back and forth. And just because we can see one, it seems a heck of a lot more real.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that's the key issue, right? I think if we can open our perception to be able to look at both of those, I think it really changes a lot for us as practitioners. And one of the quotes I love about that is one from Einstein. He said, "A problem can't be solved at the same level of thinking that created it." So it invites us to look at it from a different perspective and see if we can create a different outcome that way.
This is fun. We can probably continue on this conversation at the retreat. I feel like this is kind of part of what we're going to be getting into with people. So anybody interested, I'll put a link on here in the show notes. But we're going to be, I believe it's May. I should get the dates right here. It's like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, May. You have the dates there by any chance? I'm gonna say 14th, 15th, 16th, somewhere around there.
Yeah. So 15, 16, 17.
15, 16, 17th. Okay.
Yeah.
And at your place in Texas, some beautiful ranch property, some chef food, some great speakers.
We're bringing in a naturally trained chef, so all organic, homemade meals. So we'll have great food. We'll have yourself, the Renegade Nutrition podcast. Those guys are coming down. We have Dr. Sina McCullough, who's worked a lot with Joel Salatin on his podcast.
Yeah.
So we'll be talking about nutrition. We're talking about the autonomic nervous system. We're talking about unlocking the healer within you. We'll go deeper into, the Ozempic charade and really how to create health from the inside, and hopefully just a wonderful few days of community connection. We've connected. It's the fun of enjoying seeing people in person that you've known online for a while.
For sure. And I think these kinds of events for me, I still feel the need for retreats. And I think a lot of people in health fields really need this. We've talked about this before, because it's being a caregiver can be quite depleting, just like it is for parents and caregivers of all sorts. But I think sometimes we need to have like a little reset break, kind of step out of our norm, out of our patterns, have someone take care of us a little bit, and nurture us and what we're in need of. So I'm excited to come down and to spend time with you guys.
Well, we are honored that you're going to join us and take the trip down, and invite all your listeners to come down and meet Jeremy and myself in person, in the flesh.
That'd be cool. Well, thanks for going through all this with me. That was like even more than I was hoping for. So that's so awesome, man. I appreciate all the research and work and education that you push out there into the world.
Awesome, and thanks for your great questions and an enjoyable conversation.